where we have a special election night show for you. Of course, Dr. Patino in his office and Mr. Teachman Juan Pablo de Leon. And we're going to discuss a little bit the elections, the stress involved with that. And of course, you see the title, The Death of Democracy as We Know It, which is an interesting topic. Dr. Patino, you and I discussed this very briefly a moment ago. And Juan Pablo, I'd like to hear you weigh in on this, but most kids these days, or most young people, in fact, I would even say most citizens, arguably, don't understand even know really truly understand what the term democracy means.
Well, let me say that I tend to agree with you. Now, I do just in fairness to younger people, we were young once, right? And during those times, we had a different way of looking at things compared to how we look at them now, right? Now, I have my own biases in terms of things have gotten worse over the years in terms of absenteeism, people not wanting to vote, not wanting to participate. And I think there's a parallel between, and this is where Juan Pablo can help us a little bit. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but I think that there is something to be said about, I mean, outside of this psychiatry, psychological, and we can get back to that in a minute, but there's a lot to be said about um, the lack of civics education, right? It's like the curriculum got kind of distorted in terms of basic things like civics, history, how do we get from point A to point B, you know? I mean, we talk now about the revolution like if it's happening right now with any very little understanding of how things progress from there and how that was the beginning of a whole journey that we've been involved with, right? It is all here and now. And there's where the psychiatric psychological side gets interesting because you start getting into issues like the um, the present bias, you know, in terms of we're more interested as humans in what's happening right now and what we're going to get in the future and so on. So, what do you think about civics, Juan Pablo?
Well, I think exactly what you said. We were all young once, right? And there's this meme that gets shared around in education a lot, and it says things they should teach in school: civics, personal finance, economics, da 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 da. A bunch of things that we believe as adults. I'm like, God, I wish I would have listened to these things when I was a kid, or I wish they would have taught that to me. Well, they did, and they still do. Um, Most kids aren't paying attention, just like most citizens aren't paying attention, right?
Uh,
Which is so interesting because there's this crazy juxtaposition there where um, we're thinking, okay, people aren't participating in democracy. Meanwhile, what's happening online? People are participating in this social dialogue constantly. People are holding on to their team's beliefs with so much conviction as though they've done all the research and things like that. When I feel like even with kids, um, when I was in high school, when I was in middle school, I heard a lot of kids just spouting off the same things that their parents spouted off. We see that still, and I see it with young people my age in their late 20s who feel attacked by their political opposition. If you're a Republican, you feel attacked by Democrats, and so you like tighten up to your group. And I don't see any difference with kids. Honestly, they're very educated on a lot of issues because they have more access to political information than we did when we were kids because of social media. I do think they have more access to political disinformation as well. And I do think that a lot of Americans, especially young Americans like me, this demographic of people who maybe feel like their vote doesn't count, um, I think that we focus so much on social issues and less so on kind of the propositions and the people that you need to read about and educate yourself about because that's difficult.
Democracy only works when you actually participate, and part of that is research and understanding. Juan Pablo, I used to teach, as you know, taught economics and history. So yes, doctor, it is in the schools. Unfortunately, it's not just that the kids don't pay attention. I think there's a lack of emphasis on the specifics of how our country works. I know civics was removed as a mandatory thing from the curriculum, so people don't understand about checks and balances, don't understand how elections work, and I think it becomes incumbent upon teachers to fill in the voids. Unfortunately, when they do that, we get often, uh, you know, people say we're then trying to manipulate children. But let's get back to the stress factors of what's going on. How is it affecting the kids in the classroom, doctor? Have you had any people in your patients in your practice expressing their stress and emotions at this time?
Over the last month, especially with older people, people over 55, uh, who come to me because they have problems with anxiety or depression, and that I've been seeing them for many years. So they start talking about how overloaded they feel with the news, right? Because you basically bombarded by a constant stream of misinformation, and people are smart enough to understand that is not how one side or the other side is presenting, you know, that they understand that negativity sells.
Mm,
And but the problem is that there used to be a time, and past times are always better, right? Even though future times are promising, but the only thing that we have is what's happening right now. But when we look at how we got to where we are now, is that we stopped dialoguing. We stopped having a conversation, which is not only participation, but conversing civilly, right? When you're going to discuss politics, right? And it's not that you cannot do it. I mean, I remember 30, 40 years ago, huge discussions during Thanksgiving dinner about people from different parties, but nobody was an enemy,
mm,
right? We could have a conversation and we could agree on disagreeing, and then we would let up to the voters to decide not who was right or who was wrong, but what was the direction we were going to take, right? Right now, it's all about winning, having power and vilifying my neighbor, right? So the question is, what is the direction that we're going with all of this? And that's what causes a lot of anxiety to people. I mean, I was actually at home having lunch today, and I was watching the news, and I see this mushroom cloud of a nuclear bomb, in an advertisement saying that if you support Democrats, that's what's going to happen. That we are closer to a nuclear war than we've ever been, blah, 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 blah. I mean, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember when we had the mushroom cloud with Goldwater, who unfortunately was from Arizona at the time, right? We still have the Goldwater Institute here in Arizona, where he actually was vilified by everybody, including his own party, by coming out with a mushroom cloud, right? Now is middle ground, no big deal. So my concern is that people who are vulnerable become more stressed about these things. And what Pablo was just mentioning, many kids, especially younger adolescents, 14, 15, 16, they're still kind of parroting their parents, right? So we are giving our children bad example in terms of what is civility. The question is, should we have more of that, or should we have more civility? And if we're going to have more civility, how do we get to it? I mean, everybody is arguing now, why are we here, right? Well, it doesn't matter why we're here. We are here. Is the how to. How do we go about uh, people on the left listening to the right and people on the right listening to the left? And I think needs to start with, and I don't know if this happens in high schools anymore. Do you remember the time when there was a lot of debating in high
mm,
school?
yeah.
The debate teams, right? And it wasn't about winning the debate. It wasn't about making the point of what you feel passionate about and how you're going to be presenting that. I was at a university in California recently, and I was surprised. This is a very leftist university, and I was very surprised that they would not allow people from the right to come and lecture.
Hmm.
And universities on the right will not allow people from the left to lecture, right? Or to give a presentation or read a paper or whatever. What's the problem with that? That high schools, colleges, and universities are the places to practice civics, right? It is the place where we have to be able to challenge each other without hating each other, right? And we have gotten into the politics of extremes, and people are getting very stressed about that.
So Juan Pablo, how does that
Can
look
I?
like
Can I?
for you?
Yeah. So so I want to first point to um, what Dr. Patino said about the conversation at the dinner table, right? Um, I'm guessing at that dinner table on Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holiday, there was there's a social hierarchy, there's a patriarch or a matriarch who mediates the conversation, right? Maybe it was your father or your father-in-law or somebody, right? Your grandfather, whatever it is. And so you had a strong figure who was mediating the conversation, and there may have been people from opposing viewpoints discussing, and there was a respect for the mediator. In classrooms, many teachers, like you said, Vincent, there's many teachers who are afraid to have these political discussions with their students, even though your students crave it. They bring it up.
Absolutely.
They want to talk about it because they are not strong mediators, because they themselves at times feel that they just feel scared to mediate that conversation. Um, and what is the big thing that's missing on social media? What is the big thing that's missing in our political debates is a strong mediator, a person who is truly unbiased or has no skin in the game of whether one side wins or the other, right? Who is going to lead the conversation and pose objective questions, things like that. Um, you know, at the school, I want to bring something up. This is very relevant both to what we're speaking about now and what we've been speaking about in the last few episodes about school violence and everything like that. Today, my school went under lockdown. There was
Mm.
a gun threat at the school. Fortunately, the student, it was just a fake toy gun. But I was walking through the halls. It was passing period. And over the loudspeaker, they said, we are on a real lockdown. This is not a drill. Everybody go into the nearest classroom. You lock down. So luckily I was pretty close to my classroom. I run to my classroom. I sit in the corner. I had one student in my classroom with me. And we sit in the corner and we wait for the lockdown to get lifted. And we're all thinking the worst, right? Things start getting texted around. Even I got texts from people in the community saying, look, the kid brought a gun to school and there was a video of it and everything. I'm sure you guys will see it on the news very soon. When we got back to class, I teach foreign students. I teach students who are English language learners, and I have 3 students from Afghanistan. Um, and one of the students from Afghanistan asked me, why can Americans own guns? Why is it okay for any American to own any gun? And I know the history of that. I told him during the American Revolution, we fought a revolution against, and I won't go into the whole history, but I told him that, and so that made sense. And from there, we were able to have a conversation, right? Because his family in Afghanistan owned guns to protect themselves from crime and from terrorist attacks and things like that. And he saw military people owning guns, so he saw that in his life, and he's seen it here in the United States. But because I was able to objectively say, okay, like Dr. Patino just said, here's how we got to where we are. Now let's talk. It was able to be a productive conversation.
I think your point's well taken. Again, we're pushed to both sides. There's no one in the middle, and there's really no centrist discussion whatsoever. But concerning the elections themselves and how people may be being responding to them, Dr. Tino, what are your recommendations for people who are very stressed about what's going on?
I'm going to tell you what I told one of my patients today. I was doing a telemedicine session with her. She's 67, and she's having anxiety about the news and politics. And she recently moved to another city, things of that sort. And I always like to take people back to the idea of what is it that you control,
Mm.
right? Because we're always trying to, in interesting ways, letting people know how stressed we are, right? I mean, our partner, our wife, our kids. We do it directly by saying, I'm stressed about politics, or we do it indirectly by being angry and frustrated, and they don't know what's going on. So it spills out of your environment because you feel out of control. You feel that you cannot make decisions. So why don't you do an inventory to start figuring out what do you control? Well, you control the button, right? You can turn off the TV, or you can change the channel, right? Or you can um, move into listening to music, relaxation, read a book. I mean, things that we always have known how to do, but for some reason with social media, we have difficulty letting go of, right? But we have to practice it, right? I have this practice when I go out for dinner with my friends, in which I always pull my phone down and never pick it up, right? Even if it rings, I know there's going to be time later to listen to that voicemail, right? Or if I get a message in Facebook or Instagram or whatever I get, I don't look at it. But I have to train myself to do that, right?
Mm.
Because we have become slaved by the electronics. So it becomes very difficult for people to feel relaxed without them. So it has become a tool of contamination, but it's also a tool of anxiety reduction, right? So we had to balance that. And I'm not criticizing as being good or bad. It is. This is what we have, right? And we have to deal with what we have. Now, if the worry and the anxiety and the stress and all the uncertainty related to, are we going to have people fighting with guns if one party doesn't get what they want, right? Am I going to have police and, you know, uh, the National Guard on the streets trying to control the situation? You hear those things as possibilities, and people get pretty scared, right?
Mm.
And they just don't talk very much about it. So it's important that we let people ventilate their fears, you know, and be realistic, right? I mean, we have had bad things happen in this country before, right? But again, back to point number one, you only control the choices you make, right? So if you know that those things can happen, then you have to make certain choices about your life in the immediate future, about how you're going to be okay, right? Based on you, not based on what media is telling you, because each one of us have different ways of handling things. I mean,
So one, I'm sorry, guys.
I was, I was watching the news too, and I was looking at some people who were intimidating voters, and they have long rifles and they have hoods and military paraphernalia and stuff like that, and say, well, if they're so interested on freedom and democracy, why do they cover their faces?
Hmm.
Right? I mean, I wouldn't mind somebody trying to intimidate you if I can see their face. I mean, they can take my picture and I can take theirs.
Sounds
That would
pretty
be
fair.
that would be democratic, wouldn't it?
Yeah, very democratic. Juan Pablo, are you seeing stressed out kids about the election, or are they just tuned off because of other things in their life, worried about their boyfriends, the big game, things like that? Or are they acutely aware? Because we have so many of the adults obviously having that effect right now.
I think right now, like today, my students were talking about how they're bombarded with political ads when they're watching YouTube.
Mm.
Um, and I think most students don't really care at all. Most high school students don't care at all about these um, the presidential, the non-presidential election, right? what do we call it, a midterm election,
Midterms,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So they don't
which are
really care.
arguably more important because they're closer to us. But
Right. I agree. They don't care. I mean, I'll tell you right now, they care very little. Maybe your kids who are in competition government or, AP, U.S. history, like those kids who are very interested in politics know about it and care. But that's a very small group. Now, if you would have asked me my first year teaching in 2016, yes, the answer to your question is absolutely. There's an intense amount of anxiety, an intense amount of passion behind how people were discussing things. And I know because I had a pretty good relationship with my students, I was able to kind of, through education, through giving them, you know, historical facts, kind of quell some of those anxieties. Um, Dr. Patino, would you say that, and Vincent, same question to you, would you say that maybe when you were mediating conversations with your students in a history class, the more they knew, the less stressed they were? Dr. Patino, same thing, maybe?
Well, knowledge. I mean, and this is a very old saying, but knowledge empowers, right? Because it gives you options. It gives you the opportunity to go in different directions, and to reduce the uncertainty, right? So you make the uncertainty manageable. So yes, from I mean, uh, them knowing how we got to where we're at, and how things have evolved, and how this democracy, as imperfect as it is still one of the best democracies in the world. It may not feel that way for us because we're in the middle of it, right? But when you look from the outside, okay, you're not going to see many people wanting to go to other countries. I mean, our countries like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Spain, Italy, that had their own problems, Germany, right? Where people are migrating to. You don't have a lot of people migrating to Russia right now. You don't have a lot of people migrating to China. Nobody's going to Venezuela or Cuba, you know? So the problems we have are serious problems, but it doesn't, and I use the phrase death of democracy as we know it in a kind of a questionable way, because you cannot kill something you don't know. And if you don't know you're in a democracy, you need to start learning about what it means, right? Because everybody thinks that democracy is the same as revolution. And that's a problem. Now, we have cults around that now, in terms of the only democratic process is when I win, right? And if I don't win, uh, then it's somebody else's fault and they had to pay for it. So we really had our mini revolution back in January 6th, right? 2021. Uh, so I hope that we learn something. I hope that kids become more inquisitive, right? But I think that every contact with an adolescent is an opportunity to share, right? Because we got into focus on you have to learn these things, and then you have to score these tests, and then you have to move on. I said, what from my perspective, because I see a lot of very troubled adolescents, I always think in terms of what was the experience like for you and what did you learn from it? Don't tell me what I want you to tell me. I want to know your experience, because it's that experience the one that's going to lead you to better things. And I've said this before, when I see some kids who are suicidal, I always try to praise them from the fact that they're not dead, right? Because they have assets. We think that we're giving the kids assets, right? I have assets. I'm going to give them to you, and you're going to carry them over, right? It doesn't work like that. This is a developmental process of surviving adolescence and coming out at the other end with the best tools available so they can succeed at life.
Well, that's something that I think is shared between our two industries here, is that just like recovery is a process, right? If you're struggling with addiction or depression, or you're someone who lives with some sort of disability, the road is long. Same with
Hmm.
education. The road is long. It's a process. And like you just said, our students are often looked at as products, and they're not products. They are
Hmm.
the effects of a long process. One thing that I was thinking about, because in our pre-episode before we were on the air, I think it was 1 or 2 episodes ago, we kind of got to talking about sort of conspiracy theories and things like that
Hmm.
and cults and stuff. And I think that one problem that has penetrated our political debate, and I think it's a big cause for anxiety, is the fact that a lot of conspiracy theories are not how do we say this? They're not fantasy anymore. People are using so many resources to uncover these events that really happen. There's tons of documents that have been declassified and things like that. And so things that we once were like, oh, that's not true, are coming out as true. Obviously, conspiracies still exist, and maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll watch very interesting documentaries about them. But Dr. Patino, do you find people coming into your office? Because I find it with students for sure. People come in and they are anxious about potential problems, things that are um, basically fantasy, right? Because I don't think anybody's like, I think one of the propositions here in Arizona has to do with like giving taxes to the tax breaks to certain veterans, like Prop 131, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think Prop 310 has to do with funding the certain fire districts, right? I don't know if there's any conspiracy theory behind that, right? But there's all these conspiracy theories that people have, and anxiety that people have about, you know, these things. Do you find people coming in and kind of being unhinged in that way?
Yes, yes. However, you see, when you're dealing with reality, reality is an agreement, right? It's like democracy is an agreement. So reality is what we all agree, okay, is logical, verifiable, okay, and applicable, right? So we have parameters to decide that's true or that's not. If somebody comes and tells you Democrats eat children, right? Which is a common conspiracy theory that there are pedophiles and they
Pizzagate.
want,
Yep, all that.
you know, QAnon and all that stuff, right? I mean, they tried to move to the center, but they started as conspiracy theories. If a patient of mine comes and tells me that, I would diagnose him as being delusional because there's enough reality based data that tells me that that's extremely unlikely to have a conspiracy of so many people eating children, right? Okay. Now, if I go to a meeting and there is 500 people who believe that, then it's a cult. I can no longer call it delusional because there's enough people in that room who shares the distortion, right? So that's how you move into cultism, right? Into and then usually cults have a charismatic leader, right? And the leader by definition can never be wrong. So that creates all of this distortion of reality and it starts to grow because even though it's delusional, right? It really is um, easy to sell, right? So just before we finish the program, I do have to say, if somebody comes to my office and is speaking in tongues and rolling over the back of their eyes, right, and is twisting on the floor and is talking nonstop and he hasn't slept for a week, but I would say that patient is mentally ill, right? But if that patient is in a church, may not be.
situation to think, Juan Pablo, and also to wrap this up, your last 2 points in the question you asked. I think you're right. The kids want to know more, but I found that there's a level of profound ignorance, like what Dr. Patino mentioned, for that. And then there is an intellectual laziness sometimes, and it's easier to accept some crazy conspiracy theory, even though logic would dictate it would take all these different people to make it pull it off, rather than to take the time to dig into it and really learn and understand. I was fortunate; I actually taught economics at the university level, and when I hear people complain or even talk about communism, socialism, capitalism, I've gotten to the point where I just say, please, first before we talk about it, define it for me, and invariably they can. So I know that it's hard to have a conversation with people who have that lack of understanding. So I think all three of us have a different take on it, in the sense of our experience. For me, the side of ignorance, you the side of kids, maybe apathy, and of course, Dr. Patino's from a mental health standpoint. Once again, thank you both for being here and providing some wisdom and information to our listeners and our viewers. Please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, guys. Take
Thank
care.
you, gentlemen.